Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Black Lives Matter First Steps panel. We are so happy to have you join us tonight for what we hope will be an informative and insightful discussion. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That will resonate with all of us forever. We will never forget. These last few weeks have not only given us an incredible opportunity, but also a megaphone to connect and correct. We cannot erase history, but we can work so that we don't repeat history. The goal tonight, and with subsequent panels, will be to elevate our concerns and suggestions into solutions-oriented actions that will help drive this movement forward. While the discussion will focus on issues tonight, the state party does not legislate. We are not elected officials. We support candidates that reflect our values. We campaign and organize for those candidates to elect them to do the work that we will be talking about here tonight. We are joined by a wonderful panel. I am so excited that we know will contribute a great deal to all of us. We're making this the first in a series of panels that we intend to host because this conversation is so important and needs more than the 90 minutes allocated for tonight. We hope that you will send us your ideas for the future, for guests, and for panel discussions and topics. So once again, welcome and thank you all for being here. Tonight's agenda will include a discussion with our incredible panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. This discussion will be moderated by State Senator Mary Washington. We'll open the discussion up to our audience for some Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature through Zoom or in the comment section if you're joining us through Facebook Live. So let's get right to the amazing panel. Let me begin with some introductions. First, our Congressman Kweisi Mfume. Congressman Mfume is no stranger to us and really needs no introduction. But in the interest of properly presenting him, I will say the following. The Congressman believes in public service. From his first election to the Baltimore City Council by just 3 votes, to his 5 full terms in the United States House of Representatives, and giving up his safe seat at the request of Myrlie Evers Williams to become the President and Chief Executive Officer of the NAACP, he has served the public. After 3 successful elections this year, I am happy to say he is back in the saddle representing Maryland's 7th Congressional District through the end of this term and for a full term thereafter with all of our help in November. Congressman Mfume is married with 6 adult sons and currently serves as the chairman of the Board of Regents for Morgan State University. He's our friend and he's our statesman. Karine Jean-Pierre is a Haitian American political campaign organizer, activist, political commentator, lecturer in international and public affairs at Columbia University. She is the senior advisor and national spokeswoman for the Joe Biden for President campaign. She also served as senior advisor for MoveOn.org and a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Her book, Moving Forward, is a moving, inspiring political memoir and progressive call to arms for the Chief Public Affairs Officer inspiring political memoir that I have read that I was about to say. And I have this book and I strongly advise all of you to get it. It's poignant, it's touching, it's truthful. And you see the evolution of a young girl into this wonderful woman who is so respected by so many people nationwide. Her voice is one that we all should be very, very proud to listen to and to uplift. She is really someone that is going to be a star in our future as she continues to rise. Next, shaking his head in agreement, is my friend Wes Moore. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Robin Hood, one of the largest anti-poverty forces in the nation. He grew up in Baltimore and the Bronx, where he was raised by a single mom. Wes is a best-selling author, a combat veteran, and a social entrepreneur. Wes's first book, The Other Wes Moore, a perennial New York Times bestseller, captured the nation's attention on the fine line between success and failure in our communities and in ourselves. That story has been optioned by executive producer Oprah Winfrey and HBO to be made into a movie. He is also the author of the best-selling books, The Works, Discovering Wes Moore, and This Way Home. Wes's next book, 5 Days, I think is out now. It just came out last week on the 23rd of this month. So we're very excited about that. It explores the uprisings in Baltimore in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody through a kaleidoscope of perspectives and examines critical questions about the deeper causes of violence and poverty. Krystal Oriadha. Delighted to have her with us. She's been a community activist for over a decade. She has been an advocate on the front line of issues like bail reform, fight for 15, fair elections, food equity, LGBTQ rights, and criminal justice reform. Krystal has worked for federal and local government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and nonprofits. She is currently the Senior Director of Policy and Program for the National Farm to School Network and the co-founder and president of the LGBTQ Dignity Project. Krystal is also co-founder of PG Change Makers Coalition. She currently serves as a member of the Clinton Foundation Junior Board, vice president of Make Smart School Board, co-chair of the Prince George's County Education Roundtable, among a host of other things. Delegate Jheanelle Wilkins. Delegate Jheanelle Wilkins proudly represents the 20th Legislative District in the Maryland House of Delegates. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, she is dedicated to policy change that makes a difference in people's lives. Delegate Wilkins serves as the parliamentarian of the Maryland House of Delegates, responsible for upholding efficient, fair, and orderly procedures as the House conducts the business of the state. She also previously served as chair of the Montgomery County House Democratic Caucus. Delegate Wilkins has championed and successfully passed legislation dealing with racial profiling and justice reform, maternal health, and increasing educational outcomes for all students. Professionally, she works as the director of the State and Local Government Affairs at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. And now to our moderator, State Senator Mary Washington. Dr. Washington earned her PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University, where she began her dedication to fighting against structural inequalities based on race, class, or gender, and her keen understanding of the needs of urban communities and other vulnerable populations. She taught sociology at Lehigh University before taking a postdoctoral fellowship at the Population Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Mary Washington is a trailblazer. She made history in 2010 by becoming the first LGBTQ African-American elected to House of Delegates, and the first African-American and woman elected to the Maryland Senate. She made history again in 2012 by passing the nation's first social media privacy protection law. In her nearly 10 years in office, Senator Washington has distinguished herself as a leader, fighting for affordable access to water, protecting families at risk of losing their homes to unfair tax sales and foreclosures, reforms and economic justice for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women, making sure public schools get the fair and equitable funding, and helping unaccompanied homeless youth get the services and support they deserve. Senator Washington currently serves as chair of the Joint Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, and is a member of the part-time faculty of the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she teaches social policy, critical race theory, and applied mathematics. We have heavy hitters on this panel tonight, and I am thrilled. I'm going to stop talking, let the show begin.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lewis. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for thinking of this and having the courage to bring this forward. I want to thank, of course, all our attendees, everybody who registered. Over 500 people registered. We know we're being streamed live on Facebook. I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation, and I'm really honored to be able to facilitate it as its moderator. When Patrice Kahn-Cullors and Opal Tometri and Alicia Garza founded the Black Lives Matter movement, collectively under the phrase Black Lives Matters, they helped to reignite the continued struggle for Black freedom, liberation, and justice in the United States. As Black feminists and as same-gender loving women, they rooted their fight for freedom and liberation at the intersectionality of justice practice, and for the fight for freedom and liberation that disrupts traditional frameworks of Black activism, and a framework that historically prioritized addressing racial injustice against and over gender injustice or sexual freedom. This evening, we're taking the bold step of looking at what would that sort of disruption look like in the Democratic Party, and what would a conversation around Black Lives Matter among elected officials, people who are involved in foundations, and activists, what would that look like? And as the chairwoman said, this is just the beginning of the conversation. So just again, to review some of the logistics, This is happening on Zoom, and it's a webinar. It's being live streamed. If you have your questions, please put them into the chat box there, or you can also use the question and answer function. We're going to discuss and have a panel discussion for about 25 minutes. We're going to have about 5 or 6 questions that not every panelist is going to ask, but there's answer, but some every panelist is going to answer. And also I'm inviting the panelists to themselves pose questions if they feel. The important thing is for us to have a conversation that is lively, that's authentic, and really, as the chairwoman has wanted, moves us forward along making sure that Black Lives Matter. First, we're going to kick it off by asking each panelist if you would just give an introductory remarks of kind of where you are now and how you enter this conversation and why you're here today. And so I guess I would start with the congressman if he is able
Sure.
to. Thank you.
I guess I was fortunate enough for somebody to think that I had something to say or something to offer. And so they offered me the opportunity to be a part of this, which I quickly accepted because I think and I know that dialogue is important across a spectrum of ideas and across a spectrum of time. I have done this, I kid you not, in my own way 1,000,000 times. Since as far back as I can remember as a high school student and then later in college, these discussions always seem to take place and they're fruitful and they're helpful, but I haven't seen an end in sight. And I'm old enough to know that we could do this ad infinitum. One of the things we need to do as we focus on our own ideas and talk about things is to ask ourselves, where do we want to end up at? And that is crucial, the end point. What's the goal? What are we all striving for? The other thing is that, we talk among ourselves all the time, but we really need white people and Latinos and others to be a part of this discussion, this conversation. I mean, maybe they weren't asked, I don't know, but, Black lives do matter, and their opinions oftentimes help, as they did many years ago, in a civil rights movement, to galvanize their own and to raise these questions in their own communities with their own persons and in their families. So I guess I'm just hoping that as we go through this, we come up with an endpoint, what it is that we want to achieve out of all of this. You've got a great panel. I admire and respect all of them. And I know there are a number of people who are watching us this evening. Unfortunately, we won't hear from all of them, but fortunately, we'll get a chance to talk to all of them. And I hope our talking makes sense.
Thank you, Congressman. Delegate Wilkins, would you share?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Washington. Good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Delegate Jheanelle Wilkins. I represent District 20, which is the Silver Spring and Tacoma Park area of Montgomery County. I'm really glad to be here, especially because I got my start in Democratic politics, organizing with the Montgomery County Young Democrats, and then being elected to the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee. I really view our party as a training ground for aspiring elected officials, but also for advocacy and an entry point for us to really create the societies and the communities that we want to see. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation to really push and carve out and really make sure that we are aware and organizing and focused on the policy solutions, not just talking, but really working to put actions into place, and especially pushing on the party and your state and local elected officials as well. In the Maryland General Assembly, I have focused on a lot of criminal justice reform issues, from policing and racial profiling to looking at inmate compensation, and then also looking at various issues dealing with re-entry and also the conditions of prison as well. So I am just really pleased to be a part of this really amazing panel, and want to start off my participation by lifting up the young Black men that have died in my district at the hands of Montgomery County Police. And it has been sort of a pattern of unarmed Black men, in my particular district, District 20, that have died. And so I'm here also representing them and their families. So I want to start by saying the names of Robert White, Emmanuel Okutuga, and also Fanon Berhe. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. And we'll continue that specific dialogue as a part of this conversation. Next, I'd like Ms. Jean-Pierre, who's the Senior Advisor to the Biden campaign, and as we know, author, and would love to see where and when you enter. If you'd share with us some thoughts to kick us off.
I should know how to do this. We've been doing Zoom. My apologies there. Thank you so much, Dr. Washington, Senator Washington. I have to say thank you to my dear, dear friend, who's just been such an inspiration to me, Chairwoman Yvette Lewis. Thank you. I love you dearly and truly, and you know that. And you have been such a pounding beat for me these last several years. And I give you credit for where I am today, because you've always given me such great advice. And the esteemed panel, oh my gosh, you guys are just amazing. I've watched each and every one of you. I'm honored to be with all of you tonight. You know, we find ourselves just 4 short months away from the biggest election of our generation. This election comes at a time where we're experiencing several crises. We're experiencing COVID-19 that's disproportionately hurting our community, people of color, the Black community. We're experiencing people who are unemployed, tens of millions of people who don't have a job or have lost their jobs. More than 127,000 people have lost their lives to COVID-19. And then you put all of that, right? And then you have a video that we see of George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a good part of that, of him begging for his life, saying words that we hear too often, saying, I can't breathe. And let's not forget Ahmaud Arbery, who was weeks before that, where we saw essentially his lynching, him getting shot multiple times and chased down, a Black man who was just jogging, who was just running, as we all know. And then hearing about Breonna Taylor's essentially killing. And so, you know, we come to a place right now where I think folks have said enough is enough. We're having a real conversation about uprooting systemic racism, which is great to have the conversation, but we have to keep pushing. We have to keep saying, okay, what else? What's this policy look like? What are we gonna do? What does this look like? Because people are listening, people are watching, the world is watching. And if you look at polling, people agree and are supporting the activists who are out there in the street and saying enough is enough. And so I'm really thrilled to be here having this conversation with all of you. I didn't say good evening to everyone who's watching. And just a couple more things. If you had told me 2 months ago that we would see thousands of Americans of all backgrounds taking to the streets to support Black Lives Matter, I wouldn't believe you. And this is where we are. But to just talk about a little bit about myself, I've been in this game for more than 2 decades. And I have to say, as I was talking about this election being consequential, in my 2 decades of doing politics and working in the White House, working on the civil presidential, I've never seen anything like this in a president. Never, ever, ever, ever seen anything like this. And so we do, if we want to continue, yes, we have to have a conversation about policy. Yes, we have to keep pushing our elected officials and ourselves, but we also have to get out. We have to get out there and vote in November. And that is one of the reasons why I decided to work for Joe Biden's campaign. I've known him for a decade, more than a decade. Like I mentioned, I worked on presidential. I was in the Obama White House, and I have a 6-year-old, and I look at her every day, and I think to myself, we cannot leave a world like this, or I can't leave a world like this for her and her peers or my grandchildren if I'm lucky to have some. And I think it's important to remember that our kids are watching and we have to do better. And so I thought by jumping on this campaign and helping to push a win for Joe Biden would be a great way to do that, to have my kind of my voice in the game. And Joe Biden is a leader that we need right now. And so we have to make that happen. We have to make that happen. So thank you. It's great to see all these wonderful faces. I'm happy to have this conversation, and I give it back to you, Dr. Washington.
Thank you. Next is my constituent, my friend, my 43rd district constituent, Wes Moore. Could you share with us why and where you're entering here today?
Absolutely, Madam Senator, my friend, I'm honored to be on this virtual panel with my senator, a person who I very proudly voted for, and thankful for your service and for your friendship. Madam Chairwoman, thank you for the invitation. You continue to inspire not just me, but my whole family and countless others. I'm honored to be on the panel with my congressman, with Delegate Wilkins, a fellow Yardie. And also with Ms. Jean-Pierre, who I've just deeply admire and respect, and also you, Krystal. Thank you, bless you, and thank you. And I think about what brings me to here and to this moment, and it does actually, in some ways, that there's a lot of echoes of what Karine was saying, where this moment that we find ourselves in, where we do have this idea, we have these twin crises that have been thrown at our doorstep. And the first was this introduction of a virus that has had absolutely catastrophic health and economic implications to our society. And the truth is, when we're talking about the impacts of COVID-19, we don't know yet what the bottom looks like. And that's the danger of it, both on the health side and also on the economic side. And the other was this very unneeded reminder of how inequitable policing is in different communities. But the reality is that both of these two twin crises, despite the fact that they are different, they actually unveil the same exact truth. Because while COVID-19 impacted all of our communities, they did not impact all of us equally. And when you look at communities of color and people of color, not only contracted COVID-19 at twice the rate, but also still to this day are dying at twice the rate as well. And that policing reform is necessary for all communities. But the reality is that we watched on camera George Floyd, a man who was handcuffed on the ground, and watched another man nonchalantly stick his knee into his neck until he stopped breathing. And his name then being added to a very long list that has been laid out, and we're still adding names to. And so dealing with COVID-19 is not simply about the discovery of a vaccine. And the same as policing reform is not simply going to be about the elimination of chokeholds or no-knock warrants. What people are protesting for, what all of us are protesting for, and what we're demanding right now is a way that we are going to address racism. This is about racism. It's about something that this country has tussled with, but has never really had the ability to take down. And it's about how you watch this complete interconnectedness of what that means in terms of poverty, that you cannot talk about poverty rates if you're also not willing to talk about racism. The reality of that, even prior to COVID-19, that 23% of people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were people who were already living in poverty, i.e. that was the working poor. People who were working jobs, in some cases multiple jobs, and still living below the poverty line. The reality that 43% of all people in this country could not afford a $400 shock, and that was prior to COVID-19, and that shock came and it was a lot more than $400. And so what brings me to the work, what brings me to this incredibly esteemed panel and my excitement about being here tonight is for me, this is about justice. And it's not just about criminal justice, it's about justice of every form. It's economic justice, it's health justice, it's transportation justice. It's basic levels of acknowledgement and justice that for so many of our communities has seemed so far off. And so I'm thankful for the chance to be in this fight. And I'm thankful for the chance to be able to take words into action, and particularly in this moment.
I am muted and I'm talking. So, thank you for that. And finally, Ms. Orietta, love to hear from you. Please wrap us up this first phase of our kicking off our conversation.
Yeah, again, I want to start by saying thank you. I'm very humbled to be included in this conversation with so many people that I personally look up to. And I always tell people what brings me to this work is, to be honest, I'm not an advocate or activist by choice. It's by necessity. I realized that as a Black, gay, African woman, I don't have the luxury of choosing to fight for my mere existence in this world, because there's people that honestly are offended by my mere presence. And there's a reality and a burden that is placed on the shoulder of all of our communities to fight and advocate for ourselves, because we learn at a young age that nothing will be handed to us. And I understand that I want everyone to see that Black Lives Matter, but I also want our community to understand that all Black lives matter. And I think that's really important to me, and why I'm at the forefront of this fight is because the country has never really cared about Black lives. And as the congressman said, is there an endpoint to that? I don't know if I see one. But if we're being also honest, the world has not cared about Black women's lives. They haven't cared about Black LGBTQ lives, and nor has the Black community cared as much to represent and say our names in equal mass, even though we are at the center of so many movements. And what brings me also to this work is the reality every day when I meet mothers and family members that have lost a loved one. I met Archie Elliott's mother the other day, and I realized that she's been doing this for over 20 years. And I hold that every time that I'm tired, every time that I am angry, every time I'm upset. What centers me is that feeling that I feel is a privilege, because her son doesn't feel anymore. And that is what brings me to this work, that I understand that this isn't me fighting for a theory or an idea, but I am fighting for the ability for another mother not have to bury their child.
Thank you so much for that framing. And there's times for us to have interracial dialogue. There's time for us to have bipartisan dialogue, to reach across the aisle, to talk to our allies. But indeed, this is a conversation today among Democrats or Democratic leaning people, among Black Democratic leaders, among Black leaders. And so we're centering the conversation there in-house, in our own house. And I didn't say this earlier in my remarks. As the moderator, I find my responsibility to facilitate that conversation, to sometime push on some difficult questions, but to make sure that we are providing an authentic platform for us to really get and illustrate the core, what I believe are the core values of our Democratic Party. And so I just want to pitch out our first question, which is, and I would like to start with Congressman Cummings, and then have Delegate Wilkins answer after that, and then others. As Democrats, could you name 2 instances or times over the last 3 years around Black Lives Matters that you seem that the party is doing the right thing, but also what are some things that you believe the party nationally could be doing better? Congressman.
Well, there have been more than 2 instances when the party has attempted.
At least.
I think what it's been a matter of has been too little too late. Not for lack of effort, but for lack of timing. And in my opinion, the party, the National Party, ought to be more proactive and not wait for there to be a blow up. I'm old enough to remember the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968, and how we all got out into the streets, and there was this huge uprising. And that mirrored what had happened 3 years before in Watts, when that in 1965 blew up. And then we had the Rodney King riots, and then we had Freddie Gray and the uprisings this year. If we wait for an uprising to be proactive, we're really not proactive. So I think that, in my opinion, the National Party has to be actively pursuing policy to begin with, since that's what the party pretty much does. I mean, the George Floyd Policing Act, which I'm an author of, and we were able to pass out of the House last week, is an effort, but it is a reactive effort. If that had not happened to George Floyd or the others, where would we be today? We'd still not have that piece of legislation, that kind of policy that controls debates in every community in this country. And I think more than anything else that as we talk about this, that Wes makes a good point. This is really about racism. That's what it comes down to. I mean, this country was founded on racism. The founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence did not necessarily envision what was to happen over the next 200 years or so. In fact, the extermination of the Indian, the annexation of the Hispanic, and the enslavement of the Black man were part and parcel of the foundation that we now stand on as the United States of America. And so I think, without a doubt, rather than to wait for something else to happen and then to react, I would like to see real policy coming out of the party beyond what we just did with this policing act. And it's got some great points in it. But that debate, that policy debate on the national level has yet to occur. And when it occurs, I still ask the question, where do we want to go? What do we want to achieve? How do we get there? So that for me, I think encapsulates not my frustration, but my long perspective on this issue that has vexed this nation and continues to vex all of us in this generation.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Congressman. Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Senator. I think that the congressman really just picked up on a really important point and something that I really have seen a lot coming from the ground, especially in Democratic politics. There has been this tension around the party's role. Should the party be out front on policy issues, or should it mainly play the role of just lifting up the state and local and federal elected officials and playing that role of making sure that we get Democrats elected? There's sort of been a tension around the active nature of the party in those issues. And I think this is the time for the party in a lot of ways to get off of the sidelines when it comes to issues dealing with Black Lives Matter, dealing with police accountability, and dealing with issues from economic inequality and housing and mass incarceration. When we look at the question of the role of the Democratic Party and what the party is doing right or doing wrong, we have to first think about and acknowledge the fact that Black people, and especially Black women, have been the foundation of the Democratic Party, that we have come through and saved this party from time and time again, and that it's so ingrained in us in terms of being that loyal voting bloc. When I became a naturalized citizen in the US, it was an easy choice for me in terms of what I was going to identify as when I registered to vote when I turned 18. My parents, my uncles, my aunts, we're Black immigrants, we are Black people, and we are Democrats. But when we look at this most loyal demographic of the party and the gains that we have had, it just has not matched up in terms of those priorities. Again, when we look at educational equity, when we look at housing affordability issues, when we look at mass incarceration and this issue of policing that has been plaguing our country, we have not seen those gains and the party really stepping up. And when I say party, I'm talking about the Maryland General Assembly Democrats, I'm talking about the state party, I'm talking about national party, I'm talking about the party broadly. We have not seen those gains that we should see for a community that has been so loyal. So I would answer the question by saying that not only on this issue, but some of the cornerstone issues and priorities of Black communities, we really need to see the party out there working tirelessly and really weighing in and being at the forefront of leading on these issues.
Thank you, Delegate. Ms. Jean-Pierre, would you please share with us your thoughts as well? What are we doing? What are Democrats doing that whether it's been on the right track, and where do you see where we need to go?
Yeah, look, I'm just going to lift up what the congressman just said, what the delegate woman just said. I mean, they are spot on. I think that, it's not just the local or state level. This is a national level, and this is a moment. I think we just have to step back and realize we are in this moment. There is a sea change happening. The question is, what happened? What do we do with it? How do we really get to the other side of all of this? And so this is the window that we need to step back, take a look, and figure out how do we really truly talk about uprooting systemic racism. Because like Wes said, this is about racism. This is about racism. We're talking about this country's original sin of slavery. You know, this is where this begins, and has continued through and through and through for hundreds of years. So it's time to start dismantling systemic racism, and it's not just in the criminal justice system. It's also embedded in housing and education and healthcare and employment. And so we have to start identifying the systemic inequalities in all of their areas in order to make change. But we have to all ask ourselves, what are we going to do? People are listening. People are listening. They are paying attention. So what are we going to do with this moment?
Thank you. So for Wes and Krystal, I want to put a little spin on it. You as not elected officials or in parties, and thinking about the intersectionality of race and employment and criminality and incarceration in the U.S. And could you answer the original question, but maybe throw that piece in it? How are we doing on that intersectionality? I know each of you are very much committed in doing this work.
Yeah, I can go first. I think that I would echo the same sentiment. I feel like as a party, we haven't stepped up to really say that Black lives matter, Black wealth matters, Black education matters, the freedom of Black people and their voices and our leadership matter in a way that's substantive. I believe that there are leaders amongst our party that have done that. And I believe that there's members of our party as advocates and organizers that have pushed that in different jurisdictions. But do I think the party as a whole has landed itself on this platform of uplifting the needs when it comes to wealth, education, incarceration, for specifically addressing the Black community? I don't think so. And I think it's because it's a hard conversation to talk about the needs of Black community. For some reason, we can say people of color, we can talk about Indigenous people, we can talk about women, but when we talk about isolating the needs of the Black community, it's a hard conversation for the country as a whole. It's a hard conversation for our party. Even the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party can't have a conversation around reparations and what that means. And I think we have to digest and strip down why that is. And so I think that's one of the barriers to really seeing change in our communities. I think we have worked on different policies and jurisdictions around bail reform and getting rid of a cash bail system. But until we talk about, for example, if we have a platform in our party that is talking about sentencing, but we haven't even talked about why we have so many nonviolent felonies that target predominantly Black and brown people, then we're having one side of the conversation, but without having the true side of the conversation. It's like when we move towards legalization and the industry of marijuana in a lot of progressive places, but the conversation of ensuring that that wealth was set in the hands of the communities that have been oppressed and imprisoned off of the backs of that same industry, it didn't happen. And so I think that we have not centered the voices and the leadership of the Black community enough in this country, nor in this party, to truly understand and elevate the needs of the Black community on all levels.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Wes.
Thank you. And I echo everything that the other panelists have said. But my caveat is, I run one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in the country. So that is always that's the lens in which I look at everything. It's all about how can we focus on sustainable economic mobility? How can we focus on economic pathways for people? And I know that on the practical policy level, there are certain things that are absolutely unconscionable that we still are debating and discussing in this country. The fact that there is still even a debate about giving people a living wage. The idea that we can have people who are working a full day's work and still living below a poverty line. The fact that we still have a healthcare system that is primarily based on employment. So when you have a situation like what we just saw, where you've watched 11 years of job growth go away in 11 weeks, the other thing that's happened is not just unemployment, but people who are uninsured has now exploded. The fact that we do not have a plan for long-term childcare, because you cannot have a plan for returning people back into the workforce if you're also not supplementing it with a real childcare plan. But I think that there's also another bigger piece that we also have to acknowledge, and that really is, and something that can be done not even on the federal side, but even on the state side, is an acknowledgement of our history. An acknowledgement of, as everybody has said, you cannot disconnect economic injustice and racial injustice. And the fact that as a large society that we have not come to grips with this idea of what was the impact of the Homestead Act? What was the impact of the unequal distribution of a GI Bill? What was the impact of the federal government putting money and subsidizing the building out of the suburbs? What was the inherent impact of redlining and discriminatory housing policy and discriminatory lending policies? What has been the impact of having essentially generations that have built levels of wealth on inheritance when oftentimes that inheritance was stolen? And so I think one of the things we also have to do, in addition to dealing with the real crucial issues that we have to deal with right now, like some of the ones that I mentioned before, I feel like as a larger process, we have to have a collective truth and racial healing process, an honesty process, very similar to the way other nations have been able to do with truth and reconciliation processes that they have, whether it's South Africa or Northern Ireland or Colombia or Canada twice, where they're able to stare at their deepest wounds and be able to say the only way that we can build is if we're being honest and we're acknowledging how this process has then impacted everything that we are as a large society. And when we, as the congressman said, when we have a society that we know that was founded on beautiful ideals, but frankly was founded on racial hierarchy and was founded on stolen land and stolen labor, that our most beautiful proclamations about who we are and these amazingly elegant words of our founding fathers still have a taint to them. And I think that has to be understood and acknowledged. And then as we're going through and thinking about the context of the policies that we should be pushing and advocating for, that those things have to be kept into a context.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to sort of adjust my second question and just kind of build off of what you said in terms of a truth and recognition, and kind of thinking about what does that look like in the Democratic Party. So, so much of our public discourse around police has been around police brutality and accountability and excessive force. And in the state of Maryland, 80% of state jails and prisons populations are Black. Maryland's Black population is only 31%. Data shows that the economics of incarceration, where there's 22.6 million in bail monies being extracted from two communities in my city that are only 90% Black. And we have access, was raised by Krystal, access to criminal record expungement is still lagging in our state, when too often Black men are more likely to secure a record. And then once they've served their time, try to secure a job, housing, almost everything. We still don't have full expungement for non-convictions in Maryland. So what specific policies should or could be enacted that would address these and other issues? And I really would like Ms. Jean-Pierre to maybe tackle this. And since we are talking about an election, we're talking about, I'm a Democrat, I have we're gonna have a Democratic nominee. Talk about, what types of policies and programs could be used or from the Biden campaign when it comes to these issues we've laid out here.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the things that you just mentioned, Dr. Washington, is critical and key and important, and you see that happening across the country, and that needs to continue. You saw what Congress with Karen Bass leading the way, which she's doing, as the congressman mentioned, which is a first step to dealing with real reform and what we need to do. As far as Joe Biden, he's addressed these issues through a two-prong approach, where he's committed to doing, creating a national registry to keep track of officers involved in unnecessary force or force that has killed Black people, clearly chokeholds, banning a national ban on chokeholds. And so those are the things that he continues to talk about. And there are other things as well. And then he talks about, I mean, the thing that he's been really pushing is how do we start having that conversation of, as we've been talking about, systemic racism, right? Because yes, it's the criminal justice system, and yes, there are these ways, so these policies to kind of start fixing that, but it's so much broader. And he's talked about in his first 100 days actually bringing people together to have that real conversation, people from all different fields and areas to sit down and talk about how do we do that in housing? How do we do that in employment? How do we start moving that? How do we do that in education? Like, what are the structural things, these blocks that have been around for a long, long time? And he says it's not going to happen overnight. It will take some time because they've been around for hundreds of years, right? This is something that is embedded in our society, embedded in how people actually treat our community and how they see our community. And so those are the first kind of steps that he's talked about in addressing this. One of the things that really stuck with me, and I think it goes to what the congressman was saying. It's great for all of us, Black panelists, to have this conversation, right? It's great because we are clearly esteemed and really smart. But it does matter when a white person or a person that's not Black, right, to say and speak as well to the atrocities of what they're seeing right now. And that was something that Biden did in Philadelphia about 3-4 weeks ago. He talked about the history of this country, the history of the original sin of slavery, as I mentioned, and how did this all begin and where we still are. And it's important to have allies as well speaking to that, because that's the only way change is going to happen, really. If we don't bring everybody with us, it is not going to happen. And so that is something that he has done, is like trying to bring the country together and shining light on that, and that discussion, that very glaring, very part of history that people, we don't hear about, that's been omitted. And we have to speak the truth of this country. We have to. If we don't say it out loud, if we do not own it, then change cannot happen.
Thank you. Delegate Wilkins, you're starting this is halfway through your second term, and we're looking towards Annapolis and the General Assembly. What specific policies should or could be enacted to address the disparities, the crime, frankly, that we know is criminal justice in this city, in this country?
Absolutely. And, as we've started discussing, all of these issues really work together. We see the lack of quality education, the lack of access to it, and how that then perpetuates income inequality. And then we see historic housing and lending discrimination that has taken place, and how that turns into, Black people being particularly in overcrowded, unsafe places. And then when a pandemic hits, like what we have seen, we see ourselves who already face all types of health disparities now then being dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 crisis in this particular instance. The policies that we are talking about, they have been introduced and we need to pass them. And we also need to have a governor that is not going to veto those policies. And that's why who is in these seats really matters. The people that we place in these positions, whether they are championing an issue or either sitting on the sidelines or really working against us. We had a landmark legislation, the blueprint for Maryland, which Senator Washington is of course familiar with, that the Ways and Means Committee and EHE in the Senate worked diligently with, along with our budget committees, that really dealt with looking at everything from redoing our funding formula so that it's more equitable, to increasing pre-K access so that more people would have access to that proven tool to help increase outcomes for all students, to supporting our teachers and increasing pay and professionalizing the teaching profession, really proven methods to help increase education. We saw that hard-fought legislation be vetoed by our Republican governor. I think that the people who we put in the seats, Democrats included, really have a responsibility, and the people who we elect really have a responsibility to take those bills on housing. I introduced a lot of housing bills that deal with eviction. Many of us have been helping to lead the Maryland General Assembly in calling for housing protections right now in this crisis, because when we talk about Black lives, talk about Black health, housing is a major part of it. Home has been safety for us during this crisis. And we have seen a governor who has really just kicked the can down the road when it comes to these types of issues that are so critical to us. And the last thing that I'll mention on this is that right now there are actions that our governor can take that we have called on him to take in regards to police violence, that with a stroke of his pen, he would be able to change. And we could have some action on this issue right now and maybe save some lives. And it's been literally silence from him on that. So it's not to put it all on our governor, it's to put it on the Maryland General Assembly as well, and our candidates and our elected officials who are up and down the ballot, to say to the public that if we are talking about Black issues and the policies that matter, we have to make sure that we elect people into these seats, the elected officials into these seats who are really championing, prioritizing, and passing these bills, because they have been introduced. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know, thanks. So of course, the statement Black Lives Matter is absolutely an indictment of structural racism, right? And that it permeates every part of the United States. The panelists, everybody has said this, every institution, every legislature, every foundation, every political party. And it is of course a problem with policing. It's not just a problem with policing, but it's that as well. And the confluence of COVID-19, unconstitutional policing, the continued killing of brown and Black men and women, combined with our social and economic and racial justice issues that we're really fighting for. So again, I'm bringing it back. And I would like, again, for the congressman can address this first if you'd like, but also I want others who aren't electeds to just, let's talk about, as Democrats, what other institution and areas should we be addressing as a party?
Well, I guess since you started with me, I'll go back and try it again. I think as a party, we have to be intellectually honest about who we are and who we are not. The Democratic Party, which began as the Dixiecrats and got its real fame in the late 1960s when it wouldn't support civil rights legislation, has evolved over time. I think it was Mark Twain that says, I don't belong to an organized party, I'm a Democrat. We've morphed and morphed and morphed and remorphed. And as someone said earlier, had it not been for Black women coming to the rescue and the aid of this party, it probably would have had more losses around the nation at every particular level. But even in recognizing that, I think it's incumbent upon the party and those of us who have membership in it to make the case that we need to do something that everybody can rally around. We need a 10-point, 5-point, whatever. We need an agenda, a goal. What are we fighting for? What do we want? I mean, we know that it's got to be economic, it's got to be educational, it's got to be social, it's got to be systemic. It has to deal with health, it has to deal with the family and the new family issues, with workers and their Bill of Rights, with fair housing, with so many different things, but it has to be simple. When Newt Gingrich and his band of hooligans in 1994 overturned 35 years of Democratic rule here in the Congress where I sit, they did it with a simple 10-point plan. They called it the Contract for America, but we all know it was a contract on America. But it was so simple, as Reagan used to say, simple enough for a fifth grader to understand. And everybody got on that page at the national level, state levels, and local levels. They sang from the same sheet of music. And after a while, there was this cacophony of believers that, oh yeah, this is what we want. This is what we're all working for. And as Republicans, this is what we're going to hang together with. Now, people thought that was foolish because there were one-line sentences and a real clear set of objectives. But they ended up ending 35 years of Democratic rule in the House because they took over the entire House and the entire process. I'm not saying that we have to mimic them, but we need something when this call is over with that says to Democrats that are Black and white and Latino and uptown and downtown and in the city and the suburbs, this is where we are going. This is what we want. And I don't know that we can do that on this call, but I do know that we can start the process of thinking about this. I was at the Gary, Indiana Black Summit in 1972 when this first started. I've seen summit after summit after summit. And that's why I'm saying to you that in this instance, we really need something. And we need to be honest as we go out and try to find a way to bring people together. It's not always saying that our party is always correct or the Republicans are always wrong or neither are good. It's to hold within us a basic concept that says, as people who want more, deserve more, and need more, we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And those interests, believe me, will drive us in a concerted way to where we think we need to be. And we fix it along the way and we modify it, but at least we're moving towards something. So that's the thing that concerns me the most, when the lights go out and this is all over. I mean, we could do this again next week and the week after. It's a good effort, but we've got to know where we're going. And I know that the bright minds on this call, as I said in the beginning, all of whom I admire and respect, I know all of you and all of those who are listening now, who can't get in, who are sending in notes as we talk, can come up with something. And I believe that the Maryland Democratic Party is a good place for it to start. I don't know that that's going to necessarily happen at the national level, but I know that leadership comes from the bottom up. And if it starts in Maryland, it can find its way to bubble up to affect and change the national tone, the national picture, and the national leadership on these issues.
Ms. Oriadha, what would it mean to you that the Democratic Party, or what would you need to see to know that the Democratic Party is taking this seriously? That truly, you talked about intersectionality, that you're actually heralding what Kimberly Crenshaw just said recently, you know, that if Black lives really do matter, all Black lives have to matter. And that means gender, you know, Black lives across genders, our trans brothers and sisters. So could you say some things or some points or some ideas or things we should be thinking about as we're going forward to really demonstrate? What do you want to see? Where are the receipts? What receipts do you need to see?
Yeah, I want to really echo what the Congressman said about a plan and a strategy. I think that's so important. It's important to me as an organizer on the ground and someone that's hoping to move this movement forward, because I think that sometimes we think, and some organizers think, if we get this one thing around police brutality, if we move this forward, we can go home. Because the conversation around what do we have to address, racism is so rooted in the fabric of our being that every single institution has to be addressed. Every single system has to be addressed. And the way that it was built on this systematic, methodical system is the same way we have to strategically chip away at the system. And I think we don't have a strategy at the moment. So for me, that looks like, one, centering the voices of the most marginalized, impacted communities at the table. I think that building policies for groups of people that aren't represented are always going to be flawed. So I think the base is making sure when you're looking around the table, drafting policy or having the key conversations, asking yourself who is missing is the initial stage. And I also think it's important going back to even the local level, because I think that's something we can learn from the Republican Party, that they understood, let's take a step back and focus on local policy and how we're going to move our agenda on the local level. And that is where I think we can see systematic change. That looks like going back to the point of addressing nonviolent felonies. That goes back to addressing housing disparity. That goes back to addressing the investment that we see in our prison system and our policing versus the investment that we see in our health and human services. It looks like putting our money where our mouth is, living in a predominantly Black county led by Democrats, but not seeing the investment needed in the education, infrastructure, and wealth of my community shows me that we are not moving in the right direction. It looks like at safeguarding from gentrification. It looks at ensuring that you don't just give us the resources to aid us in the moment, like WIC programs or social services, but you make sure that you're supplying microloan programs catered to certain demographics so they can start their own businesses. It looks like putting funding into nonprofits that are led by predominantly people of color. It looks like investing in the knowledge of our own communities. And I think someone said this to me the other day, and it's always stuck with me, is that it all boils down to this. When you look at allyship, and I think the party is an ally, just as any entity is an ally to any struggle and movement. But if we're talking about an allyship to the Black Lives Matter movement, your allyship and the worth of it is directly tied to what it cost you. And it was such a profound statement because so many people say so much, but it costs them nothing. Mm-hmm. And it will cost the party to stand with the Black community in this moment and to stand with immigrants and to make a plan like the congressman said and stick to it. It might cost some allies. And in the political world, that's always a hard conversation. But if you're not willing to make those sacrifices for the bones, right, the backbone of this party, which is African-American, specifically African-American women, then there's a huge issue to the foundation of this party. And so that's what I want to see. I want to see real life sacrifice made to support and to stand in solidarity. I want to see systematic policy changes. I want to see investments. I just want to make sure that when we're having this conversation, people don't think that if we move police reform, that we've succeeded. Like, this is just one part of such a larger conversation, and racism is so rooted in everything in this country that it's going to take a sweeping look at our policy. And so, just echoing what the congressman said, we need a plan, not just to piecemeal fixing racism and fixing and addressing the needs of the Black community.
Senator Washington, I'm going to jump in very quickly because one of our guests has to leave. Karine Jean-Pierre has to go do press. That's what happens. MSNBC calls, and she's the national spokesperson and advisor to the vice president. So she does have to leave us. But I did not want her to leave without saying thank you, to let her know how much we appreciate you taking the time. I know how busy your schedule is. I know better than most how busy your schedule is. And for you to take the time to do this for us today, we are so grateful to you. If you have questions for Karine that you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat. We'll send them off to her. I know Karine will get you the answers that you need. But I just wanted to publicly thank you, and we'll continue with the panel. We know you have to leave. I love you, and we'll talk soon.
Love you too. Thank you all. Thank you for having this conversation. Incredibly important conversation. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Look forward to more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. Thank you.
Absolutely. So this is actually, thank you, Chairwoman. I was supposed to do that. Thank you. But I just got so engrossed in the conversation. And so, Wes Moore, I think, so this is our we have one sort of final question, part of this sort of back and forth on our panel, and then we are going to open it up to some curated questions. And so, Eva, I believe you're going to, sort of give us some questions that are coming from those who are participating. But I think Krystal did lay out, and also the congressman, some of what is essentially a big challenge that the Democratic Party faces, not only nationally, but in Maryland, some skepticism, right? And particularly when it comes to being a serious ally, when it comes to the fight for racial justice, and because there's a price to pay for that. But I would like to ask you, how do you think this Black Lives Matter movement, this time, how does it play in our response and advocacy to those challenges?
I think that this movement plays that it's actually it's asking all of us to ask a fundamental question of ourselves. And that question is simply, who are you willing to fight for? And who matters to you in this moment? And I think about it in context to my own growth, my own journey, and the journey of my mother, where the first job that she got that gave her benefits was when I was 14 years old. And the first job that she received, that she earned, that gave her where she could have concentrated and predictable hours, or that gave her the flexibility to work one job and not multiple jobs, was when I was 14 years old. And that ended up changing the entire trajectory of not just her life, but frankly, our entire family. And I think about that in context of this idea, because I agree with everyone on the panel that this is not just a messaging conversation. We've got to win the argument about better policies. We've got to articulate them best. We need to sell them. But also, are the policies that we're pulling together, are they things that are actually going to address the pain that we are repeatedly asking people to suffer under? And so there are things that we know, and we can even put the federal stuff to the side. I completely agree with Delegate Wilkins on this. Let's just talk about the state for a second. Because there are certain fundamental things that we can do on a state level alone that can ease the massive amounts of pain that we are asking families to endure every single day. The fact that we still have children and families who are dealing under the weight of lead poisoning. And the fact that we have children who are attending schools where they can't drink from the water fountains. We have known that this has been a toxin, a neurotoxin in our society for over a century. We have just chosen to deal with it along class and race lines. We've known for a fact that we do not have equitable transportation assets, and that for people who live in certain areas, that it is virtually impossible for you to find jobs in other areas. Not even that you can't qualify for the job, but the reality is you can't even get there. And we know the basic things like adjustments to the child tax credit, basic adjustments to the child tax credit, like making the child tax credit fully refundable, increasing benefit amounts to support children and families through the economic downturn, locking in improvements to the economy until the economy recovers, and making changes retroactive to deliver cash quickly to children and families who need it the most. Situations like that could actually end deep child poverty overnight in the stroke of a pen. Educational plans like the Blueprint for Maryland, which somehow now we can't afford. These are the type of things where I think it's fundamentally coming down to who is it that we're going to choose to fight for in all this? Who are we going to be creative for? Who are we going to be innovative for? Because the reality is we've been innovative and creative for a lot of other people. Our society shows we know how to be innovative and creative. Our society shows we know how to find money when there's no money to be found. And so we then, as a society, then really have to truly ask, not even just how our elected officials, but frankly, it's all segments of society. It's corporate America. It's the foundation world, where I'm a big believer that the foundation world has an important role to play. They're not going to solve not just many, but any of the problems. There's not enough foundation dollars in the world to be able to do that. But foundation dollars and philanthropic dollars, they can be catalytic. They can be investment capital. They can be capital that can prove points and then bring them up to our governmental partners to be able to scale the innovations that we know that are working on a smaller basis, and then is passing them off to our government leaders and saying, this program that we fund works. And now it's about how do we add government dollars to be able to truly put an end to the problem we're trying to solve. And so I think this is really the point where we all have to not just message it better, but we've got to come up with better policies. And policies that truly answer the question of who is it that we're going to fight for, and who is it with our taxpayer dollars that we care about? Because these budgets we are pulling together, they are absolutely moral documents in the way that we're thinking about our future.
Thank you. Delegate Wilkins, and then I'm going to wrap this section up with the Congressman. But Delegate Wilkins, I know you have something to say on this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. I think that when we think about this conversation and start to really chart out what our solutions are in terms of police violence, I would really like for us to take a step back and reimagine policing in the United States of America and really think about how we can transform policing. I think that, of course, we have been focused in on the end result and the worst things that have happened, which are the police shootings and the killings and murders of Black women and Black men. We also need to think about the everyday harassment of, Black men in my district who are standing outside the McDonald's having made a purchase and get harassed by police officers. The situations where it's a loose cigarette that turns into, police harassment and then someone that is being killed. I think we need to think about the everyday interactions as well as how we prevent those from taking place, the harassment, the brutality, the racial profiling, as well as look at the police shootings and the violence. And I think that in order for us to really reimagine policing, of course, I am supportive and I want to lift up. I know Senator Jill Carter has taken the time out to be on the line and has messaged us in the chat. I know that Delegate Acevedo and others have been leading the state when it comes to Anton's Law, when it comes to various pieces of legislation like use of force, civilian review boards. I am supportive of all of that. And we have a House work group that's in place that the Speaker of the House has put together to look at those issues. And I'm confident that we'll be working really hard to make sure that those come out. But when we take this step back and think about reimagining how our police functions, we have to first look at the role of police and the fact that our police officers are called out for mental health crisis, the truant student, they're called out for the homeless person that someone doesn't like that's sitting, on the street or sleeping on the street. And we look at that role and the impact that has, whether it is a daily impact of harassing and racially profiling, but then people in my district like Finan Berhe, who I mentioned at the beginning of this call, who was dealing with a mental health crisis and the police officer came guns blaring. And instead of a de-escalation or mental health response, we have this armed officer pointing a gun at him type of response. And that resulted in this young man, a recent college graduate, being shot and killed. So when we think about the role of police in those types of situations, I think first and foremost, those are situations where our police officers should not be responding. How can we reduce the role of police in our community? I think we need to assess in every single area how we are spending money when it comes to policing. And I mean from in Maryland, I mean looking at our training commission over to the literal funds that we are spending on state police and in other areas, and then reallocate that to community services like mental health services and increasing mental health responses. So I think that's something we have to be careful about, is that we can pass the laundry list of bills and we should absolutely do that. But if we don't have the conversation to really reimagine and rethink, reframe, and think about how we can be transformative in those day-to-day interactions that our police officers are having currently, and reduce and reimagine what a police system looks like, a police system that focuses on serious crimes, but one that is also service-based, service-focused. The officer that killed George Floyd, he operated as if he was God, as if he had the power of life or death, as if he had the right to take that life. And we have too many officers who maybe have not committed that specific crime, but have that same mentality and that same attitude. So I think it's absolutely critical that before we go into all of the policy changes and passing all of the bills, which we need to do, we really need to have the conversation, a clear understanding of how do we be transformative in the role of our police and how our police interact with the community.
All right, so we just have about 15 minutes. Again, this has been a great conversation, but I absolutely want to open it up. And those of you, we're going to save the chat. There's been some great data and information that's been there. We're going to share that. But Eva, we have a question that we should put to the panelists.
Yes. Hey, everyone. So there have been a lot of comments in here in Zoom, but then also in the Facebook about mass incarceration, and it did come up. So I think what the folks who have been giving those comments and questions, we know there's a problem with mass incarceration. What are the things that we can do on a federal level and a state level to address that?
So would Congressman Mfume start with the federal level, and then anybody can answer the other one.
You have to unmute yourself. There you go. Oh, Congressman, you need to unmute.
I will go right ahead, Mary. And on the next round, can I be last for a change? I'd like to have the benefit of everybody else's thinking instead of leading it off.
Fair enough.
Let me say a couple of things about mass incarceration. Some of it is popular. Sometimes people don't want to hear it. There's still a lot of people here in this Congress and around the world who get beat up for the crime bill of 1994, 26 years ago. And everybody says that led to mass incarceration. And I've always said, with that, let's put it in context, and then let's talk about what we do today in terms of policy. Because in 1994, murders were at an all-time high in 27 American cities. In Baltimore, 400 people almost, I think it was 388 that died that year, maybe 395. Rape and assaults were at an all-time high. 20 Black mayors looked at their cities and it looked like New Jack City. Blood was flowing in the streets. Mothers were losing their children and children were losing their parents. 75% of all opinion polls in the Black community said that Black people favored the crime bill. They didn't like it, but they favored it because in the absence of that, they felt they had nothing. We were going to too many teenage funerals and comforting too many teenage mothers. Blood was flowing in the street and people wanted change. And so that bill, which everybody goes back to today and say, oh, it was the boogeyman, you have to understand the context in which that bill came about. It failed the first time and then it came back and passed. Now, when it passed, of course, it had some things that made it slightly better. It had the Violence Against Women's Act because women were under all sorts of threats in our society in the 1990s and had no course of recourse to do anything about it. So that was established. That Violence Against Women's Act today is still in place. Ban against stalking and all these other things. There was a ban on assault weapons. It was a 10-year ban because the Congress didn't have the courage to make it permanent, but there was a ban on assault weapons. There was $16 billion for community policing. But people looked at, I think, a couple of the other aspects of the bill and said, that led to mass incarceration. Let me just say to you and remind myself that 90% of the people who are in jail for state and local crimes, not federal crimes. So it is a bit of a misnomer to people to continue to grab something that's popular and say it was the 94 crime bill 26 years ago that led to mass incarceration, when in fact, in my opinion, it was not. Now, people can certainly disagree with that. And yes, Joe Biden voted for it and Bernie voted for it and 2/3 of the Congressional Black Caucus. Doesn't make it right. It's just, again, we have to look at where this nation was at that point in time and what Black communities wanted, what Black people were saying they needed because of the violence and the death. What we need now, I think, is to make sure that the participants are at the table. We can intellectualize the need to change policy. We know, I think most of us do, based on the studies, where the real policy changes need to be to deal with incarceration, mass or otherwise. Sentencing disparities, we can start there. Differences in sentencing for different types of crime and different types of substances, we can start there. But we know where the changes need to be. The question becomes, do we have the political will and the heart to make that a part of the things that we want? You know, I said earlier, this 10-point agenda that everybody can agree to, that becomes one agenda for all of us moving forward. And I think as I'm listening to people tonight, that I hope many of you will agree that rather than just to leave this where it is, we can do more. Now, let me just say this might be a little revolutionary. I love Yvette Lewis, and that's why I'm saying it. I think that the Maryland Democratic Party ought to be the state party that leads the way on this. I think we've got the legitimacy, we've got a great executive director, we've got a chairperson who understands and gets this. And if we don't do it, who will? I mean, there are other good states out there, but I don't know that they're having this discussion. And as I said earlier, I always thought that leadership comes from the bottom up. And so in national politics, Maryland, in my opinion, is primed and ready to be the leader on that, just by evidence of the desire to want to hold this forum and other forums like this, and to bring people together who may not always agree and who have a conversation that's sometimes difficult, but it's a conversation that occurs nonetheless. So I'm going to yield back before I get any trouble, Mary, and I'll wrap things up at the end.
I was hoping you would get yourself in a little bit of trouble. Thank you. So who would like to join with this conversation? I mean, again, it's important. I mean, I'm glad that you talked about the '94 crime bill, and I think that in part it's that bill, and we certainly understand the context. I think the critique that is still salient is the racist underpinnings that is still a part of the criminalization of Black bodies. And so that's what we need to make sure is no longer a part of the people who are in leadership in our party. And I think not so much the vote. Certainly the vote happened. We can critique for the vote, but what I'm hearing, what I'm reading here is that there's just, again, this ideology that still exists in the party or in members of the party that criminalizes Black bodies. So does anyone else want to join in on that?
Yeah, I think that having an honest conversation around mass incarceration, we have to know that that crime bill and legislation like it plays such a huge role in the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, and not because it was necessarily intended that way by the authors of the bills and bills like that and legislation on the state level. It's because of what I like to call the unintended consequences of legislation. When you don't factor racism into the legislation that you're writing, you're missing the application of policy. And a great example is when we worked on bail reform in the state of Maryland. And one of the consequences of a win around bail reform was seeing that a lot of judges were just not releasing or offering bail for Black and brown people that were arrested. And so the idea was to how do we make sure that we're decriminalizing poverty? The idea was that if we had this win, you'd see a lot more people on nonviolent offenses being able to go home because you're innocent until proven guilty. But the reality of the exact thing that we were fighting for made it harder to bail out individuals on lower rates or for individuals have the opportunity to go home. A lot of grassroots organizations that I've worked with that focus on bailing out mothers on Mother's Day and that do court watch programs have seen the reality of what we fought for. And so it's understanding, even with different circumstances and the best intentions, the underbelly of racism and how policy and legislation is going to be applied differently to Black and brown people is a reality that we can't even predict the outcome of. And we have to also look at when we talk about history and taking all the steps back and looking at even the root of the police and industrial prison complex, we have to understand that police is rooted from slave patrols, right? Mm-hmm. We have to look at the industrial complex of prison was for free labor. Mm-hmm. We have to understand that policies that were put in place around loitering and trespassing was just so that they could arrest Black people for being and existing in this country. And so when you understand all of those systems of how the system was built, how now it's privatized for profit, it's when you look at a hotel and it has beds, it doesn't survive unless people are renting it. Same with the prison system. If you have a system built on profit, it doesn't survive unless someone's in the prison. And so I think we have to understand that because racism is so rooted in everything we do, even myself as advocate have found myself fighting for something that had unintended consequences for my community because I was taken aback by the audacity of racism and how it's applied to our communities. And so I think it's just that honest conversation about unintended consequences with the best intentions, because racism is so real that everything is always going to be applied differently to Black and brown people until we truly address the fundamental root of racism in this country?
Well, let me just say, in addressing it, we have to have the people most affected at the table, which is what I was saying earlier. You know, I'm a high school dropout. I don't know what it's like to walk across the stage and get a diploma. I was a gang member in Baltimore at the age of 16 after my mother died in my arms. I was arrested 13 times by the age of 19 by the police, who just every time they saw my black face threw me in the paddy wagon and put a phone book against my head and beat it with a blackjack. It's a wonder that some of my friends didn't die from the concussions they received. I was a teenage father. By the age of 22, I had 5 children. No skills, no anything, beat up by the police many times. At some point in time, you understand what racism is. Trust me, you understand it. And I think there are a lot of people who do understand it. I don't think that we have to be taught, if we're Black, what racism is. And I think most of us know that it's in every vestige of this society, which is why the reparations bill is so very important. But we also have to talk about what can we do until we have the next conversation. All the bad things that may have been done legislatively and otherwise, what can we do to help save Black men in the street who, unlike me, are not going to save themselves and who may not have somebody to take care of them until they're able to live long enough to understand things. And I just have to say this, it gets me in trouble every time, but I work with kids in the street. I look them in the eye like people look me in the eye, and I remind them that you can do better than this. You don't have to do this. And they look at me and they are scared as hell because they know they can't get out of that. They're trapped. They don't even want people to see me talking to them. And it's a tough feeling when you're a young Black male and you want to get out and you can't. And we've got to find a way to continue to say to them, you don't have to do what you want to do or what society is dragging you to do, because then you do become a statistic. And whether there's a bill or not that legislates anything against you, if you break the law, they're going to throw everything they can at you and you become a person that's non-productive in our community and a father to a child that's never been born. So I think we've got a responsibility on the policy side legislatively, but also in terms of humanitarian efforts. And I know we're out of time, and I don't want to prolong this, but let me just say thank God for Wes Moore and what he's doing.
Well, that's a nice transition because we're going to give Wes 30 seconds, give Krystal 30 seconds, and let my colleague, Delegate Wilkins, do a final 30 seconds and then pass on to our chair. So, Wes.
Thank you so much. And in 30 seconds, I'll say that we have to be able to address this issue of mass incarceration from every level. We have to be able to address the fact, as Delegate Wilkins was saying, that we are having police officers and calling police officers to do everything. And when we're looking at the people who are incarcerated, oftentimes they are by simple interactions that should not have been incarcerating offenses in the first place. If you look at what happened to, for example, if you look at what happened to Freddie Gray 5 years ago, what triggered everything, what started everything off was the fact that he made eye contact with police and ran. Here's the point. That's only a crime in certain neighborhoods. It's a crime in that neighborhood because that triggered probable cause. That should not have been something that was an incarcerating offense in the first place. We also need to address the fact that when we have people who are incarcerated, that we need to reinstate, not just in the state of Maryland, but across the country, the idea of reinstating Pell inside of prisons and allowing people to get educations and allowing people to get prospects and job opportunities that when they come out, they actually have a pathway when they return back to society. On the reentry piece, we have to make sure that we are asking people who are even serving small sentences that we're essentially giving them all a life sentence. When you're telling them when you come back home, yes, welcome home, but you can't live in public housing even if your family's there. And you can't apply for certain jobs because you have a felony record. And you can't go for Pell Grants and all these other college scholarship opportunities because you have a record. So you're asking people to try to return back to a society when you continue to have barriers that are standing in the way of them being able to actually do that successfully. So in 30 seconds, we have to address this from a holistic perspective as we're talking about real justice reform.
Thank you. Ms. Orietta, Krystal.
Yeah. I'm very thankful for this conversation and opportunity. I think that we need to continue to have this conversation. And I want to echo what the Congressman said about we need a strategy. We need to lay out a policy plan so that we can systematically attack this beast of racism, and then lay out a platform on how we elevate the needs and voices of our community. And I just ask everyone that is an ally to ask yourself, what has it cost you to be an ally? And have you really stood for justice and for communities that are marginalized, are at the fringe, and making sure that you're constantly asking yourselves, because you should be at the forefront of this fight. It should not just cost us. And then for all of us that are in this horrible state today, fighting for our very existence and right to live, I just want to remind you that you're not alone. And you can find, there's not one way of being an advocate, not one way of being an activist. And there's so many ways you can show up to be on the front line of this issue. And the one quote that I live by is, greatness is not a measure of who you are, but the impact that you have on others. So I just ask everyone to continue to live to be great.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Delegate Wilkins, bring us home.
Thank you, Senator. Quickly on the topic of mass incarceration, I wanted to add the point that policing is usually the first step when it comes to mass incarceration. That's how Black people are coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And so when we're talking about the issue of policing, is directly related to mass incarceration. When I came into the Maryland General Assembly, we had barbering without a license as a crime in Maryland, that someone could go to jail for 1 year for simply cutting someone's hair. That was a bill that I introduced and passed in my first session to eliminate that. And we have so many things on the books in Maryland where, for the simplest crime that disproportionately affects African Americans, the simplest actions are a crime in our state. And criminalization of poverty is a really very, very big issue that a number of organizations and legislators are working to address. I want to also just thank the party for this conversation and thank the leadership of Yvette Lewis, who was someone that I truly admire, who was very inspiring to me as a Black woman and a young elected official. So I appreciate her making space for various voices, not only in this conversation, but in a lot of her actions as chairwoman. So thank you so much to the staff and to leadership of the party. And finally, to the audience, the listening audience that is with us, the last points that I want to leave you with are that who we elect matters. And I think that you've heard that throughout this entire conversation. It matters so much who is championing the issues that we care about. Don't let the conversation shift. We are on the cusp of change right now. Don't let the conversation shift to cosmetic changes or, what big company is giving lip service to this issue. Let's not let up until we see a transformational change. And I believe that we are on the cusp of that. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you. And looking at the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, looking at making sure we're not privatizing or militarizing our police forces and further. I want to thank, and looking at, you made this point earlier, that the defunding the police movement is really about shifting those priorities and focusing on things that we know that work. These are things, standing up for people, standing up for families, for fairness and equity is something that Democrats can and should be at the forefront. I've just been honored that we could begin to have this conversation. I look forward to future conversations. Chairwoman Lewis, this is your party to wrap up, but know that they've heard it. They're going to continue this dialogue, and that you've got a supporter and a friend here.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and this is exactly what I envisioned when we started talking about this. I wanted this to be a beginning, not an end. I know that I've seen several comments in the chat. Oh, we have a lot more miles to cover. This is just the start. We haven't even scratched the surface in the things that we're going to discuss. As I listen to people talk, I keep hearing this conversation about the party, the party. The party is all of us. The party is every single person on this call. It's not the 8 or 9 people that are on 275 West Street, or the 180 plus people that are in the General Assembly, or the members of the Democratic Central Committees, or the Democratic clubs or the Democratic constituencies. It is every single one of us. And all of us have to be a part of this change. All of us have to be a part of this conversation. All of us have to be a part of coming up with this plan, this 10-point plan that is very simple. And I certainly agree with the congressman on that. Keep it simple so that people can understand. We don't need to show that we have a full dictionary's words of vocabulary. We don't need that. We just need to keep it simple so that people can understand it, so that people can follow it. And that is our charge to all of you, to send us your suggestions. Send us your suggestions for future panels. Send us your suggestions for the plan that the congressman talked about, that we can start to pass on to our elected officials to see if this is really something that we can implement. Help us push the Maryland Democratic Party to be the voice for you, to get this message out so that we can get to the people that will push this agenda forward. These solutions are great, but it means absolutely nothing if we don't vote. We cannot enact a thing unless we get out and vote. And we should vote in every election. And while national elections are important, and they really are, your local elections are vital. That is the life's blood to what's happening right here in your state right now, to what you want to see happen. So when it's time to vote, don't call your neighbor and ask who should you vote for. Don't ask your neighbor to help you fill out your ballot. Don't do that. What you need to do is become an informed voter. That means you go to town halls, you go to forums, you go on websites, you interact with the people that are running for office, you learn their policies, you learn their positions, be able to articulate their positions, be able to challenge them on their positions and push them in the direction that you think the state needs to go in. And if not, vote for someone else. But the most important thing is get out there and make your voice heard. Let me tell you something. The voter suppression that is going on in this country right now is an acknowledgement of how powerful your vote is. If it wasn't so powerful, they wouldn't try to take that away from you. So recognize the power that you have and use the power that you have. That is the only way we will have the community, the state, and the country that we deserve. All of us have to be a part of this process. You will hear from us again. We hope to do another one next month, and the month after that, and the month after that, until you get tired, because this is a conversation that we cannot let die. As I said before, we can't erase history, but we don't have to repeat it. So the main thing I want to do is make sure that we don't repeat history. We learn from it, move forward, we grow, and become a stronger, united Democratic Party. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to the panelists. I could not have asked for a better group for our inaugural panel. Thank you all so much for being a part of this tonight, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Right.
Thank you, darling.
Hey, Eva, can you wait a sec to end it?
Hello, everyone. This is Eva Lewis, Executive Director for the Maryland Democratic Party. Thank you so much for joining us for this first in a series of events that we will be having. I know there have been a couple questions about where can we send comments or questions for follow-up, please send that to info@mddems.org. Once again, that's info@mddems.org. Please send all your questions and comments there. Once again, that's info, info @mddems, that's with an S.org, info@mddems.org. Thank you so much for attending.